The dust of dry willow was a language of its own. It spoke of seasons, of scarcity, of the fine-ground patience required to live in the New Mexico territory. In the spring, it was a red haze kicked up by new life. By late summer of 1878, it was a fine white powder, the ghost of a river that had surrendered much of its strength to the sun. It settled on the stiff spines of the sagebrush, coated the windows of the general store, and dusted the brim of Catherine Sterling's hat as she looked out over the parched rangeland that bore her late husband's name. The Sterling Ranch was hers now, a legacy of sweat, debt, and stubborn pride. From the porch of the modest timber house, she could see the heat shimmering above the valley floor, warping the distant shapes of the cottonwoods that clung to the banks of the Willow River. The river was the ranch's lifeblood, and it was shrinking. Every morning, she rode the fence line, her eyes scanning not just for breaks in the wire, but for the subtle shifts in the land that foretold hardship. She was a practical woman, her hands calloused from mending leather and her gaze direct. Grief had been a luxury she couldn't afford. Survival was a full-time occupation. The county tax was due, and Silas Crowley, a man who collected land the way a vulture collects bones, had made his offer. It was less an offer and more a threat veiled in politeness. He wanted her water rights, and he knew she was vulnerable. In the town of Dry Willow, a dusty collection of buildings huddled around a single main street. Life moved at the pace of a tired horse. There was a post office, a saloon whose swinging doors sighed with every entrance and exit, a stark white church with a perpetually hopeful steeple, and the sheriff's office, where the law often seemed as sun-bleached and faded as the sign above the door. It was into this simmering quiet that Jake Morrison had arrived a few months prior, a solitary figure drifting in with the season's dust. Jake was a man built of silence, a former soldier. He carried the war not in stories, but in the stillness of his posture, in the way he'd choose a seat with his back to a wall. He was lean and weathered, his face a map of sun and sorrow, but his hands, when dealing with a horse, were as gentle as a prayer. He worked odd jobs, asking for little and saying even less, his past a locked room no one in town had the key to. A shadow of a rumor followed him. Something about a wrongful charge of horse theft up north, a misunderstanding born from drink and a head injury. It was a vague enough story to be dismissed by most, but sharp enough to be used as a weapon by those who might need one. His only true companion was the open country. He understood the logic of the land, its honest cruelty and its spare moments of grace. He saw the same logic in horses. They didn't lie. They reacted to what was real fear, patience, aggression, calm. It was a language he preferred to the duplicity of men. Silas Crowley was a master of that duplicity. He was a portly man whose expensive suits were always filmed with the very dust he sought to conquer. As the owner of the largest cattle concern in the valley, he saw land not as a home, but as an asset. The Sterling Ranch, with its prime access to the Willow, was the last piece he needed to control the entire valley's water. He operated with a smile that never reached his cold, calculating eyes, and he had an ally in Deputy Hale, a lawman whose loyalty was available to the highest bidder. The annual town horse fair was meant to be a reprieve from the oppressive heat and the quiet desperation of a dry year. It was a day of rare community, of wagering and laughter, held in a wide corral on the edge of town. Ranchers brought their best stock, and cowboys their wages, to bet on who could break the most spirited broncs. The main event this year was a magnificent black stallion, captured wild in the high country. His coat absorbed the sunlight, and his eyes held a furious intelligence. They called him Tempest. One by one, cowboys, full of bravado and cheap whiskey, tried to ride him. Tempest met them with a violent, explosive grace, a whirlwind of muscle and fury. He wasn't just bucking, he was fighting for his soul. A local ranch hand was thrown so hard his shoulder dislocated with a sickening pop. Another, one of Crowley's men, was scraped raw against the corral fence before he could even find the saddle. The crowd, at first cheering, grew more subdued. their excitement curdling into a kind of fearful respect for the animal's untamable spirit. Silas Crowley watched from the sidelines, a smug look on his face. He enjoyed the spectacle of lesser men failing. He saw the horse as just another asset to be broken and owned. Then, Jake Morrison stepped forward. A hush fell over the crowd. He wasn't known as a bronc rider. He was the quiet man who fixed things. He moved not with a showman's swagger, but with a slow, deliberate calm. He didn't climb the fence. He walked to the gate and let himself in, closing it gently behind him. Tempest, still heaving from his last battle, snorted. His body coiled like a spring. The other cowboys had approached with ropes and spurs glinting. Jake approached with empty hands held open at his sides. He didn't walk straight at the horse. He circled the edge of the corral, his steps measured, his eyes never leaving the stallions. He spoke, his voice low and steady. Not words of command, but a soft, meaningless murmur, the sound of water over stones. Tempest's ears twitched, swiveling to track the sound. The rage in the horse's eyes began to recede, replaced by a wary curiosity. Jake stopped 20 feet away and simply stood, waiting. He let the horse come to its own conclusions. It was a conversation without words, a negotiation of trust. Minutes stretched into an eternity of dust motes dancing in the sunlight. Slowly, Tempest took a step forward, then another. He lowered his head and sniffed the air in Jake's direction. Jake remained perfectly still. He was offering a choice, not a challenge. Finally, he took a slow step forward, then another, until he was close enough to reach out. He didn't touch the horse's face, a gesture of dominance, but extended his hand toward its powerful shoulder. Tempest flinched but did not bolt. Jake's fingers made contact, resting lightly on the coarse, warm hair. He stood like that for a long moment, simply breathing with the animal. When he finally moved to swing a leg over the horse's back, it was a fluid, seamless motion. He settled into place without a saddle, his weight light. Tempest tensed, his muscles quivering, but he did not buck. Jake leaned forward, his hand resting on the horse's neck, his voice a quiet rumble against its ear. He urged the stallion into a walk, then a trot, circling the corral as if they had been partners for years. The crowd was stunned into silence, then erupted into a roar of disbelief and admiration. They had just witnessed something beyond mere skill. It was a form of magic. Catherine Sterling, watching from beside the post office, felt a knot in her chest loosen. She saw not a drifter, but a man of profound patience and understanding. In a world of brute force, he had chosen a different path. Crowley's men, however, exchanged uneasy glances. Their boss paid for control, and this quiet stranger had just demonstrated a power they didn't understand. Silas Crowley himself narrowed his eyes. Morrison was no longer an insignificant drifter. He was a variable. It was in the midst of this celebratory chaos, with half the town crowding the corral to congratulate Jake and get a closer look at the now docile Tempest, that the crime occurred. Two figures, their faces obscured by bandanas, slipped into the back of the post office. The postmaster was out with the crowd, the door unlocked. The heavy iron safe was pried open. Its contents, a small coffer of ranch payrolls and private savings, emptied into a canvas sack. The job was quick, professional, and went entirely unnoticed until the postmaster returned to find his office in disarray and the safe's door hanging open like a broken jaw. Panic spread faster than a grass fire. Deputy Hale, who had been conveniently near the saloon, took charge with a bluster that barely concealed his incompetence. He stomped around the crime scene, contaminating any tracks, and began asking leading questions. "Anyone see any strangers round here today? Anyone acting suspicious?" All eyes, guided by the subtle suggestions of Crowley's men now circulating through the crowd, turned toward Jake Morrison. He was the newest stranger in town. He had a rumored past, and he had just created the perfect distraction. An old prospector swore he saw a man with Jake's build lingering near the alley behind the post office an hour before the fair. Another claimed the boot prints found in the dust outside the back window were the same worn-down style Jake wore. The whispers grew into a steady hum of accusation. Jake, standing beside Tempest, found himself suddenly isolated, the circle of admirers replaced by a ring of suspicion. He said nothing, his face an unreadable mask, which only seemed to confirm his guilt in the eyes of the fearful townspeople. The next morning, the heat returned with a vengeance, and the town's mood was just as foul. Silas Crowley chose this moment to pay his visit to the Sterling Ranch. He rode up in a polished buggy, a stark contrast to the working ranch around him. "Catherine," he said, tipping his hat as she met him on the porch. "A terrible business in town yesterday. Simply terrible. Makes a man worry about who he has in his employ."
"I don't have anyone in my employ. Silas?"
"Not since my foreman left last month," she replied, her voice level. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her worry. "Precisely my point. A woman alone, managing all this. It's a heavy burden, especially with the river running so low." He let the words hang in the air. "I heard you were impressed by that Morrison fellow. The one who rode the stallion?"
"He has a way with horses,"
Catherine said, her tone non-committal. "So it seems. He also seems to have a way with safes," Crowley said, his smile thin. "The whole town is talking. They say Deputy Hale is building a strong case. With Morrison's history, well, it doesn't look good. It would be a shame for the Sterling name to be associated with such a man." He paused, letting the implication sink in. "My offer for the land still stands, Catherine. It would solve your tax problems. It would relieve you of this burden. In these uncertain times, a cash offer is a safe bet, safer than trusting a man like that." He was tightening the noose, using the town's fear as his rope. He was linking Jake's reputation to her survival, forcing her to choose between financial ruin and siding with a potential criminal. After he left, leaving a cloud of dust and quiet menace behind him, Catherine stood on her porch for a long time, the dry wind whipping strands of hair around her face. She was trapped. Crowley was right. Hiring Jake was a risk. The whole town would turn against her. But she kept replaying the scene at the corral, the violence of the other men, and Jake's profound, unshakable calm, the way he had earned trust instead of demanding submission. Her decision was made not in her head, which was full of Crowley's threats and the town's whispers, but in her gut. It was a choice rooted in character. That afternoon, she rode into Dry Willow. The townspeople watched her pass, their faces a mixture of pity and disapproval. She ignored them. She found Jake by the livery, where he was tending to Tempest, who now followed him like a shadow. He was an outcast, the target of a town's collective fear, yet his focus was entirely on the well-being of the animal. He looked up as she approached, his eyes guarded. He expected accusation, like he'd received from everyone else. Catherine dismounted, her movements deliberate. She stood before him, the dust settling around her boots. "Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice clear and steady, loud enough for the men loitering outside the saloon to hear. "I saw what you did yesterday. My fences need mending and my stock needs a firm hand. The pay isn't much, but the work is honest. I'd like to offer you a job at the Sterling Ranch." Jake Morrison's acceptance of her offer was a single, quiet nod. It was an agreement that passed with no more ceremony than the wind stirring the dust between them. He arrived at the Sterling Ranch the next day at dawn, not with a bedroll and a pack horse, but with only the clothes on his back and the black stallion, Tempest, trailing him with a devotion that looked more like a partnership than ownership. Catherine gave him the small bunkhouse that her former foreman had used, a clean, Spartan room that smelled of pine soap and solitude. The first days were a silent apprenticeship in understanding one another. Work was the language they shared best. They began with the northern fence line, a stretch of wire and posts that sagged with neglect and the constant pressure of the wind. Catherine worked with a fierce, practiced efficiency, her hands knowing the familiar rhythm of stretching wire and hammering staples. She had expected Jake to be a typical hired hand, working hard but without investment. Instead, she found he worked with a deep, unsettling stillness, his movements economical and precise. He didn't waste a motion or a word. "My late husband used to say this fence was the only thing keeping Crowley's ambition from swallowing us whole," she remarked on the second day, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of a gloved hand. Jake sighted down the line of newly straightened posts. His eyes squinted against the glare. "Good fences don't stop a man who wants what's on the other side," he said, his voice a low burr. "They just show you where he's coming from." The simple truth of it silenced her. It was a confirmation of her deepest fears, spoken with the calm finality of a judge's sentence. But hearing it from him didn't feel like a threat. It felt like an acknowledgement. He saw the battlefield as clearly as she did. A subtle humor began to thread its way through their long days. It was a wit born of hardship, dry as the landscape itself, while reshoeing one of the ranch horses, a mare with a temperament like a cornered badger. Catherine found herself struggling. The mare danced and pulled, refusing to plant her hoof. "She's particular about who handles her feet," Catherine grunted, straining to hold the leg still. Jake, who had been sharpening a tool nearby, walked over. He didn't reach for the horse. He just stood and watched for a moment. "Seems to me," he said, his tone perfectly even, "she's just telling you you're doing it wrong." A flash of indignation rose in Catherine, but it died just as quickly when she saw the faint ghost of a smile at the corners of his mouth. It wasn't a smirk. It was an observation. She sighed and stepped back. "All right, Mr. Morrison, show me the right way." He approached the mare with that same quiet murmur he had used on Tempest, his hand resting on her neck, his thumb stroking the tense muscle. The mare's ears, which had been pinned back, flickered and then relaxed. She quieted, and within a minute, she was standing placidly, allowing him to lift her hoof and examine it as if she'd been waiting for him all along. This quiet competence was a constant source of both comfort and a strange, unfamiliar unease for Catherine. She was a woman who had prided herself on her independence, on her ability to manage this ranch alone. Jake's presence highlighted how much of her energy was spent simply fighting against the grain of things, while he seemed to move with it. The land itself was a relentless adversary. A freak hailstorm in late afternoon sent them running for cover, the ice pellets battering the tin roof of the barn like a drumroll of doom, shredding the few vegetables she'd managed to coax from her garden. Weeks of dry heat turned the grazing grass to a brittle, yellow whisper, and the constant threat of a spark kept them on edge. Coyotes, emboldened by the scarcity of rabbits, grew daring, and Jake spent 2 nights sitting up with a rifle across his lap, his silent vigil protecting the new calves. He never complained. He simply saw what needed to be done and did it. Their partnership on the ranch solidified, but the world outside its fences remained hostile. A trip into Dry Willow for supplies was an exercise in social isolation. Heads would turn as they rode down the main street. Catherine on her steady bay and Jake on the formidable Tempest. Conversations would cease. The storekeeper was civil but clipped, his eyes darting toward Jake as if expecting him to pocket a can of beans. Deputy Hale made a point of swaggering over to them, his hand resting on his pistol. "Sterling," he'd said, pointedly ignoring Jake. "Surprised to see you keeping such company. Folks are saying it ain't proper. I'm more concerned with what's practical than what's proper." "Deputy," Catherine had retorted, her voice like ice. "Mr. Morrison is the best hand I've ever had." Hale had sneered. "A hand is one thing, a fox in the henhouse is another." The pressure from Silas Crowley was more insidious. He didn't approach her directly again. Instead, a notice appeared nailed to the door of the post office, announcing a special meeting of the town council. The topic was a formal review of all water rights pertaining to the Willow River, citing the unprecedented drought conditions. It was a legal maneuver, a public strangulation disguised as civic duty. Everyone knew it was aimed squarely at her. The council was composed of merchants and ranchers who were all, in some way, indebted to Crowley. Catherine felt the walls closing in. The ranch wasn't just land and cattle to her. It was the last tangible piece of her husband, Robert. It was the dream they had built together. Losing it would feel like losing him all over again. The weight of this legacy was a constant pressure, a demand for a strength she wasn't always sure she possessed. Yet, in the quiet evenings on the porch, watching Jake with Tempest in the corral, a different fear began to surface. It was the fear of a life lived only in defense of the past, a heart barricaded as securely as her land. Jake's quiet presence was a crack in that wall. He never offered sympathy or gentle words. He offered something far more rare, a shared silence, a sense of a burden jointly carried. For Jake, the Sterling Ranch was becoming dangerously close to a home. The steady routine, the meaningful work, the quiet respect from Catherine, it was a balm on a wound he'd carried for years. After the war, he'd drifted, unable to settle, convinced he was a ghost walking among the living. The men he'd lost, the things he'd seen, they had hollowed him out. He kept people at a distance because he believed he was a magnet for trouble, that anyone who got close would eventually be caught in the undertow of his misfortune. The wrongful charge up north had only cemented this belief. Now, here was a woman who had looked at all the rumors, at all the suspicion, and offered him not just a job, but a measure of trust. The urge to protect her, to protect this fragile peace, warred with the deep-seated instinct to flee before disaster inevitably struck. The wind that night was a living thing. It was a hot, dry wind from the south that scoured the valley, rattling the windows of the house and making the old timbers of the barn groan. It carried the scent of dust and distant rain that would never fall here. Catherine was in the house, poring over the ranch ledgers by the light of a kerosene lamp, the numbers blurring into a meaningless dance of debt. Jake was in the bunkhouse, the wind a familiar, unsettling lullaby that reminded him of nights spent on open ground, waiting for an enemy that might never come. The first sign of trouble was a flicker of orange against the dark square of her window. It was a frantic, unnatural light. Then came the terrified whinny of a horse, a sound of pure panic that cut through the howl of the wind. Catherine was on her feet in an instant, her heart seizing. She threw open the door and saw it. The barn, her barn, the heart of the ranch, was on fire. Flames licked up the dry timber walls, roaring as the wind fed them, turning the structure into a giant, hungry furnace. Jake was already moving. He burst from the bunkhouse, pulling on his boots as he ran. He saw what she saw, not just a building burning, but a death trap for the dozen horses stalled inside. Panic was a useless luxury. Their eyes met across the yard, and in that split second, a silent command passed between them. She would get the water pump going. He would get the horses. He grabbed a horse blanket from a railing, soaked it in the water trough, and wrapped it around his head and shoulders. The heat was a physical blow, even from 50 feet away. The roar of the fire was deafening, punctuated by the cracking of beams and the shrieks of the animals. He kicked open the side door of the barn, a wave of superheated smoke and ash billowing out to meet him. Inside was a vision of hell. The air was thick and black, burning his lungs. Through the swirling smoke, he could see the terrified eyes of the horses, their bodies slick with sweat, kicking at their stalls, rearing and screaming. They were blind with fear. He knew he couldn't lead them out one by one. The roof could collapse at any moment. He fought his way through the chaos to Tempest's stall. The black stallion was agitated, his powerful body trembling, but his eyes were clear, fixed on Jake. There was fear, but there was also trust. Jake didn't bother with a bridle or saddle. He threw the stall door open, vaulted onto Tempest's back, and leaned low, his voice a command against the horse's ear. A single word lost in the din, but understood nonetheless. Tempest responded instantly. He moved with purpose into the main aisle, a black silhouette against the raging fire. The other horses, lost in their own terror, sensed the stallion's directed energy. Jake, clinging to his mane, began to work the latches of the other stalls, kicking them open. He and Tempest became the calm center of the storm. The stallion nipped at the reluctant, nudged the frozen, and herded them with his sheer presence toward the gaping, fiery maw of the main barn doors, which the wind had just blown open. One by one, the panicked horses bolted out into the relative safety of the night. Their coats singed, their eyes wild, Jake and Tempest were the last to emerge, bursting through the collapsing doorway just as a massive roof beam crashed down in a shower of sparks behind them.
Out in the yard, Catherine,
joined now by a few neighbors drawn by the inferno's glow, watched in awe. They saw Jake, covered in soot, his shirt smoking, slide off the stallion's back. He didn't rest. He immediately began moving among the terrified horses, his voice low and calming, checking them for injuries, his hands gentle and sure. He moved through the chaos he had just conquered, restoring order. The barn was a total loss, a blackened skeleton against the dawn that was now breaking, but every single animal was alive. The small crowd of onlookers, who had once whispered about Jake being a thief, now stood in silent, humbled respect. They hadn't seen a drifter or a criminal. They had seen a man who had walked through fire, with nothing but courage and an unbreakable bond with an animal, to save the lives of creatures that couldn't save themselves. Catherine walked over to him as he finished calming the last of the horses. The fire was dying down to smoldering embers, and the wind was finally beginning to ease. She didn't have the words to thank him. They felt small and inadequate. She simply stood before him, the ranch's future a smoldering ruin behind them, and looked at the man who had just saved its soul. In his soot-streaked face, she saw no pride, only a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. And for the first time, she wasn't afraid of the cracks in her own defenses. She felt a seed of trust, planted in a moment of shared desperation and watered by an act of selfless courage, finally and irrevocably take root. The smoke had barely cleared before the town of Dry Willow began to rewrite its story about Jake Morrison. The man who had been a suspected thief the day before was now the hero of the Sterling Ranch. Neighbors who had previously offered Catherine only pity now arrived with calloused hands and hammers, ready to help clear the debris. They brought food, offered spare lumber, and spoke of the fire in low, angry tones. It was arson. Everyone knew it. A deliberately cut lantern wick had been found near a pile of hay at the back of the barn, a place no lantern had any business being. Among the first to arrive was Nora Quinn, the town physician. She was a woman whose calm competence was as much a part of her medicine as the salves and tinctures in her leather bag. With auburn hair pinned tightly and eyes that missed nothing, she moved with an air of authority that few in the valley dared to question. She was a voice of reason in a town often swayed by fear. "Hold still," she commanded Jake, her touch gentle but firm as she cleaned a burn on his forearm. They stood near the water trough, the morning sun already baking the soot-covered ground. You were lucky. A few seconds more and this would be a matter for skin grafts, not goose grease. "The horses are safe," Jake said, his voice raspy from the smoke. It wasn't a boast, but a statement of the only fact that mattered to him. "The horses are safe because of you," Nora corrected him, her eyes meeting his. "Silas Crowley won't be pleased. He prefers his problems to burn away, not to be rescued." She tied a clean linen bandage around his arm. This wasn't a random act. "Jake, this was a message for Catherine, and a warning to you." He knew she was right. The fire, the robbery, the pressure on Catherine, they were all threads of the same rope, and Crowley held the end of it. The talk of a drought had always felt wrong to him. In the war, he'd learned to read the land, to understand its rhythms. The Willow River was low, yes, but it felt deliberately choked, not naturally tired, while Catherine organized the well-meaning but chaotic efforts of her neighbors. Jake saddled Tempest. "I'm riding upstream," he told her, his voice low so only she could hear. "Something isn't right with the water?" She just nodded, her face smudged with ash. her eyes full of a trust that felt heavier than any saddle. "Be careful," was all she said. He rode north, following the sluggish current. Tempest moved beneath him with a powerful, ground-eating stride, the stallion's senses as keen as his own. The farther they went from the Sterling Ranch, the more the landscape confirmed his suspicions. The riverbed grew wider, the banks steeper, signs that a stronger current had once carved this path. Yet the stream itself remained a pale ribbon in the center. After 2 hours of riding, he found it, tucked into a narrow canyon where the river made a sharp bend. A crude dam had been built. It was a messy construction of fresh-cut timber, rock and packed earth, clearly designed not for longevity or proper irrigation, but for immediate and drastic effect. It bled the river, allowing only a fraction of the water to pass through, diverting the rest into a deep pool that was already beginning to stagnate. On a nearby pile of discarded supplies, he saw the telltale stencil of the Crowley Cattle Company. It was the physical proof of Silas Crowley's silent war. He had been starving her ranch, trying to force her to sell for pennies on the dollar. The fire was just an escalation, an attempt to hasten her ruin. Jake didn't touch anything. He was a scout gathering intelligence, not a soldier starting a fight. He memorized the construction, the placement of the main timbers, the way the water was being illegally channeled. This was the kind of evidence that could stand up in court, if a man could find a court that wasn't in Crowley's pocket. When he returned to the ranch late that afternoon, he found a new energy had taken hold. A young cowboy, barely a man, was there, his face alight with hero worship. His name was Tom Bradley, a hand from a neighboring spread. He was lanky and earnest, with a shock of sandy hair that fell into his eyes. "Mr. Morrison," Tom said, practically tripping over his own feet in his haste to approach Jake. "I saw what you did, with the fire and with Tempest. I ain't never seen anything like it." Tom gestured toward his own horse, a jumpy-looking gelding that was pulling at its reins. "I was wondering, this fella, he's got a mean streak. My boss says to just beat it out of him, but it don't seem right. I was thinking maybe you could show me." His voice trailed off, his request an act of faith. Catherine was nearby, directing 2 men as they salvaged usable timber from the wreckage. She stopped and watched, intrigued. She had only seen Jake's effect on horses, never the process. Jake looked from the boy to the nervous horse. He saw the animal's fear. The ears flattened, the white of its eyes showing. Then he looked at Tom's hands, clenched and uncertain on the reins. "First thing," Jake said, his voice even and calm. "You're telling him you're scared. Your hands are tight. You're expecting a fight, so that's what he's getting ready to give you." He didn't lecture. He guided. "Loosen the reins. Let him feel like he has a choice. Now watch his ears. They're his first words. When they're back like that, he's worried. When one swivels, he's listening. When they're forward, he's curious." Jake walked slowly around the horse, never taking his eyes off it. His body language relaxed and non-threatening. Now his eyes. "See how they're wide. He's seeing too much. Stand here on his left side. Let him get used to you in one spot. Let him know you're not a predator circling him." He pointed to the horse's muzzle. "And his nose. When the nostrils flare, he's tasting the air for danger. Wait for them to soften. That's when you know he's starting to trust you." Catherine leaned against a fence post, forgetting the ruined barn, forgetting Silas Crowley. She was captivated. Jake was translating a silent language, revealing a world of communication she had lived alongside but never truly understood. He was teaching the boy not how to break an animal, but how to earn its confidence. It was about respect, not domination. The tenderness in his instruction, the profound empathy he had for a creature's fear, struck a deeper chord in her than any poetic compliment or charming smile ever could. This was his strength, a quiet, capable gentleness that could face down a fire and soothe a frightened animal with equal grace. It was the kind of strength a woman could build a life around. Later that week, Jake rode into town for a bottle of liniment from Nora Quinn. The bandage was off his arm, but the burn still ached. as he was tying Tempest to the hitching post. Deputy Hale emerged from the saloon, his face flushed with midday whiskey. He swaggered toward his own horse, nearly stumbling, to steady himself. He planted a boot up on the hitching rail, leaning forward to tighten his cinch. It was an arrogant, thoughtless gesture, but for Jake, it was a lightning strike of revelation. The sole of Hale's boot was distinctive, fitted with a custom pattern of hobnails that formed a small, grim star on the heel. Jake froze. His mind flashed back to the day of the robbery. He remembered the chaos, the accusations, but most clearly, he remembered kneeling by the back window of the post office while everyone else was shouting. He had seen a single, clear boot print in the fine dust, left by someone who had climbed out in a hurry. The pattern in the dust had been a small, grim star. The pieces slammed into place with brutal clarity. The robbery wasn't a crime of opportunity that he was framed for. It was a carefully planned diversion, and Hale was in on it. He and Crowley had orchestrated the whole thing, the timing during the horse fair, the stolen payrolls to create panic, the immediate casting of blame on the town's newcomer. It was a coordinated attack, and he had walked right into the center of it. He was not just fighting for a woman's ranch. He was fighting a corrupt system. A snake with its head in the sheriff's office and its tail wrapped around the valley's water supply. He bought the liniment, his mind racing. He couldn't go to the sheriff. The sheriff was likely on Crowley's payroll, too. He couldn't make a public accusation. It would be his word against a lawman's, and his reputation was still fragile. He needed more than the memory of a boot print. He needed the dam. He needed proof so undeniable that not even Crowley's influence could bury it. He rode back to the Sterling Ranch as dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the sky. He found Catherine on the porch, a rifle across her lap, watching the shadows lengthen. She no longer took safety for granted. He didn't waste time. He told her everything. The dam, the Crowley stencil, the hobnailed boot print that matched Deputy Hale's. He laid out the conspiracy in plain, unvarnished words. Her face grew pale in the fading light, but her eyes never left his. She wasn't shocked. In her heart, she had known the evil they were facing was deeper than a simple land dispute. "What are we going to do?" she asked. Her voice was quiet, but it held no fear, only a steely resolve. "Tonight, I'm going back," he said. "I'm going to get a piece of that timber with Crowley's mark on it, and I'm going to make sketches of the dam's construction. We need evidence we can take to the territorial marshal, someone above the county, above Crowley."
"It's too dangerous, Jake. They'll have men watching it."
"I'll be careful," he said. "I'm better in the dark than they are." He looked out over the valley, the first stars beginning to prick the deep indigo sky. "I need you to be ready. I'll be back before dawn. Meet me at the bend in the river, just past the old cottonwoods. There's a warm spring that feeds into it there. It's sheltered. No one will see us." He was asking her to trust him completely, to meet him in a hidden place with evidence of a crime that could get them both killed. It was a pivotal moment, a threshold they had to cross together. Catherine looked at the man before her, his face grim with the weight of what he was about to do. She thought of his hands, capable of both incredible gentleness and, she now realized, of dismantling the web of corruption that was strangling her home.
"I'll be there," she said. "Before the sun comes up. I'll be waiting."
The journey back from the dam was a slow crawl through darkness. Jake moved with the ingrained patience of a hunter, keeping to the shadows, every sense alive to the night's subtle language. The moon was a sliver, offering little more than a ghost light to guide him. Tucked inside his shirt was a crude sketch of the dam's construction and a small, heavy piece of timber he had carefully sawed off. The Crowley Cattle Company stencil, a dark brand of guilt upon it. He had done it. He had the proof, but the victory felt hollow, overshadowed by the risk that still lay ahead. The grime of his work clung to him, a mixture of sweat, dirt, and the stagnant smell of the choked river. He felt tainted by the deceit he had uncovered, and the thought of meeting Catherine this way, of bringing this foulness into her presence, was unbearable. He reached the designated meeting spot well before the first hint of dawn. The bend in the Willow River was a small sanctuary, sheltered by a high bank on one side and a thick stand of cottonwoods on the other. Here, a geothermal spring seeped from the rocks, mixing with the river's chill to create a pool of milky, warm water that steamed in the cool air. It was a place of quiet peace, a world away from the harsh realities of the valley. He needed to wash away the night's work, to face her as a man, not as a creature of the shadows. Leaving Tempest to graze on a patch of hardy grass, Jake stripped off his clothes, the night air a cold caress on his skin. He waded into the pool, the warmth a welcome shock that soothed his aching muscles and the raw tension in his soul. He scrubbed the dirt from his hands and face, the water turning murky around him. For a few precious moments, he was just a man in a river, the weight of the war, the false accusation, and Crowley's conspiracy momentarily lifted. He closed his eyes, letting the current pull the weariness from his bones, existing only in the sound of the water and the whisper of the wind in the cottonwoods. Catherine had not been able to sleep. The house, once a fortress of solitude, now felt empty and vulnerable without Jake's quiet presence in the bunkhouse. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind, sounded like a threat. She had risen an hour before she needed to, her mind a whirlwind of hope and fear. She dressed in the dark, her movements practiced and quiet, and slipped out of the house, leaving a low-burning lamp in the window as a sign of normalcy. She walked, not rode, wanting the journey to be as silent as possible. She arrived at the river bend sooner than she had intended. The sky was still a deep, star-dusted indigo, the horizon only just beginning to soften to a bruised purple. She moved carefully down the familiar path, her senses on high alert. She heard the gentle burble of the water before she saw it, a comforting sound in the immense silence. As she neared the edge of the bank, peering through the last of the brush, she saw a shape in the water. For a heart-stopping second, she thought it was a log or a shadow. Then the shape moved, and she realized with a jolt of profound embarrassment that it was Jake. She froze, her first instinct to turn and run, to melt back into the shadows and pretend she hadn't seen, but her feet seemed rooted to the spot. Before she could force herself to move, her boot caught on an exposed root hidden in the long grass. Her balance, already precarious on the uneven ground, was lost. A small, startled cry escaped her lips as she tumbled forward, her arms flailing. She slid down the last few feet of the slick, muddy bank and landed with a great, ungraceful splash in the cold part of the river, just outside the warm pool. The shock of the icy water stole her breath. She came up sputtering, soaked to the bone, her hair plastered to her face. In the water, Jake had whipped around at her cry, his own surprise as stark and sudden as her fall. For a long, mortified moment, they simply stared at each other, two figures caught in a tableau of utter absurdity. He, a man trying to find a moment of peace. She, a woman who had just shattered it. The tension was a palpable thing, thick with embarrassment and the unspoken things that had grown between them. Then, a small tremor started in Jake's chest. His lips, which had been set in a hard line of shock, twitched. A low chuckle escaped him, a sound Catherine had never heard before, rich and genuine. It was like watching a rock crack open to reveal a hidden spring. The sound was so unexpected, so completely at odds with the gravity of their situation, that it broke through her own mortification. A bubble of laughter rose in her throat, and then another, until she was leaning back in the shallow water, laughing so hard her sides ached. The pre-dawn quiet was filled with the sound of their shared hilarity, a pure, healing sound that washed away the tension and the fear. Jake moved toward her through the water, his laughter subsiding into a wide, honest smile that transformed his entire face. He was no longer the guarded, wounded soldier. In that moment, he was just a man, amused and unguarded. "Looks like I wasn't the only one needing to wash away the night," he said, his voice warm. He reached a hand down to help her, and she took it, his grip strong and steady. The water, which had felt shockingly cold, now seemed less important, as she stood, dripping and shivering. He didn't let go of her hand. The current was surprisingly strong, tugging at her heavy skirts. Jake instinctively shifted his body, placing himself upstream of her, his solid frame breaking the main force of the river. He was a shield, a human dam against the cold rush of the water. She looked up at him, her laughter fading into a quiet awe. The first light of dawn was just beginning to touch the sky, casting his face in soft, gray tones. She saw the lines of exhaustion around his eyes, but she also saw a light within them she had never seen before.
"I'm sorry,"
she said, her voice barely a whisper.
"I didn't mean to storm in on you like this."
The smile on his face softened, becoming something more tender, more profound. He looked at her, standing there soaked and disheveled, but with a spirit that had faced down drought, fire, and the greed of powerful men. He thought of how she had crashed into his solitary, ordered life, bringing with her chaos, danger, and a reason to fight again. "You're the only storm I'd ever welcome," he said. The words were simple, spoken without flourish, but they landed in Catherine's heart with the weight of a solemn vow. It was the most beautiful thing anyone had ever said to her. A storm was a destructive force, a thing of chaos and fury. But he had welcomed her. He had seen the turbulence she brought into his life and had not turned away. He reached with his free hand to the bank, where he'd left his clean, dry shirt. He shook it out and gently draped it over her trembling shoulders. The gesture was intimate, protective. His fingers brushed against her neck, a touch as light as a moth's wing, yet it sent a jolt of warmth through her entire body. "We need to talk about the other storm," he said, his voice returning to a more serious, lower register, the one Crowley is brewing. Standing there in the river, with his shirt warming her shoulders, they spoke. He told her in detail about the dam, about the fresh-cut timber and the deliberate way it was constructed to strangle the valley. He pulled the piece of wood from his discarded trousers and showed her the stencil. He laid his drawings, now slightly damp, on a flat rock, explaining how the diverted water served no purpose but to create a false drought. She listened, her mind sharp and focused, but her heart was aware of other things, the warmth of his body so close to hers, the strength in the hand that still held hers, the quiet intensity in his eyes. They were partners. The pretense of employer and hired hand had been washed away by the river. They were two people standing together against a common enemy, bound by a shared purpose and something more, something fragile and new that was taking root between them.
"This is it,"
she said, looking at the evidence.
"This is what we need."
"It's a start," he replied, "but Crowley and Hale own the county. We need to get this to the territorial marshal in Santa Fe without them knowing." He looked down at their joined hands, as if noticing them for the first time. He didn't pull away. "My past? The reason they could pin that robbery on me so easily? It's a storm I've been running from for a long time."
"You don't have to run from it with me, Jake,"
she said softly. It was a promise. For the first time, they were choosing to face the turbulence together. They were standing in the same river, weathering the same current, and neither of them was backing away. It was a turning point, a silent agreement that went far deeper than words. They were so lost in their private world that they didn't notice the subtle shift in the landscape around them. They didn't see the flicker of movement high on the opposite bank, deep within a thicket of reeds and cattails. They didn't hear the soft, metallic click of a spyglass being put away. From his hidden vantage point, one of Silas Crowley's hired men lowered his glass, a cruel, satisfied smirk on his face. He had been sent to watch the dam, but he had found something far more valuable. He had watched the whole scene unfold, the woman's fall, the shared laughter, the quiet intimacy. Crowley had believed the drifter, Morrison, was a tool, a pawn to be manipulated. But what he was seeing was something else entirely. The drifter wasn't just working for the widow. He cared for her, and she, in turn, trusted him. The man settled back into the reeds. His job done, he would ride back and report what he had seen. Silas Crowley was wrong. Jake Morrison wasn't Catherine Sterling's weakness. It was the other way around. The proud, stubborn widow of the Sterling Ranch had just become the drifter's one and only vulnerability. And Silas Crowley was a man who knew exactly what to do with a weakness. The morning after the river, the world felt both sharper and more fragile. The evidence Jake had gathered, the branded piece of timber and the detailed sketches, lay on Catherine's kitchen table. A declaration of war. They knew they couldn't win this war alone. Their word against a wealthy cattle baron and a corrupt deputy was not enough. They needed a credible witness, an ally whose integrity was beyond question. They needed Nora Quinn. They rode to her small office behind the general store, taking the back paths to avoid the main street. Nora listened in silence as they laid out the story, her expression growing more grim with each detail. She examined the wood, studied Jake's sketches, and tapped a thoughtful finger on the tabletop. "A boot print is circumstantial," she said, her voice practical and direct. "A drawing is an accusation, but a map, proper measurements, and a sworn affidavit from a physician who has examined the evidence, that is something a territorial marshal might listen to." She looked from Jake to Catherine, her gaze steady. "This is dangerous. You know that, but it's the right thing to do. I'll help you." For the next 2 days, the three of them worked in secret, under the cover of a moonless night. They rode back to the dam, while Jake stood guard with his rifle, his senses tuned to the darkness. Catherine and Nora worked by the shielded light of a lantern. Catherine, who knew the river's every mood, pointed out how the banks were unnaturally eroded on one side and dry on the other. Nora, with a surveyor's chain and a level, took precise measurements. Calculating the volume of water being diverted, she made notes in her neat, clinical script, documenting the fresh saw marks on the timbers and the non-native soil used to pack the earthworks. She was creating a scientific record of a crime, translating Crowley's greed into a language of cold, hard facts. They were building a case, not with guns, but with logic and truth. Their clandestine work did not go unnoticed. Crowley's spy had reported on their movements, and the response was swift and public. A formal notice of tax foreclosure was nailed to the door of the Sterling Ranch, the paper a stark white wound against the dark wood. It gave Catherine 2 weeks to pay the full amount of her back taxes, an impossible sum, before the county would seize the property for public auction, an auction everyone knew Silas Crowley would win. The town, which had briefly united in sympathy after the fire, now fractured. Fear was a more powerful motivator than goodwill. Merchants who depended on Crowley's business suddenly found reasons to be busy when Catherine entered their shops. Ranchers who had offered help now tipped their hats and hurried past, unwilling to be seen as allies of a woman so clearly in Crowley's crosshairs, a pair of rough-looking men, strangers to the valley, took up residence at the saloon. They didn't work. They just sat on the boardwalk, cleaning their pistols and watching the world with lazy, predatory eyes. They never set foot on Sterling land, but their presence was a constant, simmering threat, a promise of violence held in reserve. Jake felt the pressure coiling in his gut. He needed supplies, a new whetstone for his tools. He knew a trip to town was a risk, an invitation for a confrontation, but avoiding it would be a concession to fear. He rode in on Tempest, the great black stallion, a symbol of the untamed spirit Crowley was trying to crush. He found the confrontation he was expecting in the saloon. Deputy Hale was at the bar, nursing a whiskey, his face puffy and smug. The 2 hired guns were at a corner table, pretending to play cards. The moment Jake pushed through the swinging doors, the low murmur of conversation died. Hale turned on his stool, a slow, deliberate movement. A sneer spread across his face. "Well, look what the cat dragged in, the hero of the great Sterling barn fire." He raised his glass in a mocking toast. "Come for a celebratory drink, Morrison, or just to count the money you lifted from the post office." Jake ignored him and walked to the bar. his back to the room, but every nerve aware of the men behind him. "A beer," he said to the nervous bartender. "Too good for a whiskey," Hale continued, his voice getting louder. "Playing to the room? Or maybe you're just saving your money. Heard the widow Sterling is having some tax trouble. Must be hard, working for a woman who can't even pay her bills. Or is the pay not in cash?" The insult hung in the foul air, crude and deliberate. Jake's hand, resting on the bar, tightened into a fist. He could feel the familiar, hot rush of adrenaline, the soldier's instinct to meet a threat with overwhelming force. The war had taught him that a swift, violent response was the surest path to survival. He could turn. He could break Hale's jaw before the deputy could even think of reaching for his gun. The memory of 100 brutal, necessary actions screamed at him to act. But then he saw Catherine's face in his mind. He saw her standing in the river, drenched and laughing. He saw her leaning over the kitchen table, her expression fierce and determined as she planned their legal fight. Violence was Hale's language. Crowley's language. It was the language of the past he was trying to escape. Responding in kind would make him no better than them. It would prove their accusations right. He slowly relaxed his hand. He took the beer the bartender slid toward him and took a long drink, his eyes on his own reflection in the dusty mirror behind the bar. "You're a sad man." "Hale," Jake said, his voice quiet but carrying in the sudden silence. "You think your power comes from that tin star and Crowley's money, but you're just a dog on a leash, and you're barking so loud because you know it." He placed a coin on the bar, leaving the beer half finished. He turned, not looking at Hale, but at the two men in the corner, his gaze as hard and flat as a stone. He gave them a slow, deliberate nod of acknowledgement, a silent message that he saw them. He knew what they were, and he was not afraid. Then he walked out of the saloon, the swinging doors sighing shut behind him, leaving a silence more profound than any shout. He had won, not by drawing a weapon, but by refusing to become one. As the days shortened and the pressure mounted, the sky began to change. The relentless, bleached-out blue of summer gave way to a bruised, heavy gray. The air grew thick and humid, carrying the scent of ozone and wet earth. Clouds, dark-bellied and ominous, massed over the mountains to the west. A real storm was coming, the first big rain of the season. What should have been a blessing was now a terrifying threat. At the ranch, Nora Quinn voiced the fear that was gnawing at them all. She held up the map she had so painstakingly drawn. "That dam wasn't built by engineers. It was built by thugs," she said, her finger tracing the location in the narrow canyon. "It's not designed to manage a steady flow, let alone a flash flood. If we get the kind of rain this sky is promising, the pressure will be immense. If that thing breaks, it won't be a gentle flood. It'll be a wall of water, timber, and rock. It will scour this whole valley, and the town is directly in its path." Crowley's crime, born of private greed, had become a public menace, a potential catastrophe for the very community he sought to control. The water he had hoarded was about to become his weapon against everyone. The irony was as bitter as alkali dust. The day of the court hearing arrived with a low, oppressive sky and a wind that moaned around the corners of the house. It wasn't a trial, just a preliminary hearing about the water rights survey, but they all knew it was the first battle in the war. Catherine dressed carefully, choosing a simple, severe dress of dark gray wool. It was the armor of a respectable widow, a costume she wore to face a town that was ready to condemn her. She sat at her late husband's desk, a pen in her hand, the formal document for power of attorney spread out before her. Jake stood by the window, watching the first fat drops of rain begin to splatter against the glass. He was dressed in his cleanest shirt, his boots polished, ready to stand beside her. "You don't have to do this," he said, his voice low. "I can go as your hired hand. I can speak for you." Catherine looked up from the paper, her eyes clear and unwavering. "As my hired hand, they will dismiss you. As my legal representative, they have to listen. You understand the evidence. Jake,
You understand their tactics. You see the whole map of this battle in a way I can't. Robert built this ranch with his hands, but he always said the real fights were won with your head." She dipped the pen in the inkwell. The scratching sound of the nib on the paper was the only sound in the room, a small, defiant noise against the rising drumbeat of the rain outside. She signed her name Catherine Sterling, the letters firm and clear. It was more than a signature. It was an abdication of the lonely power she had clung to for so long. It was an act of absolute faith, placing the legacy of her past and the hope for her future into the hands of the quiet, wounded man who had come into her life like a storm and had shown her how to stand in the rain. She stood up and handed him the paper. Their fingers touched. It was a simple transfer, a piece of paper passing from one hand to another, but it felt like a vow. "The law of water and the law of men," she said softly. "You go and fight their fight in their courtroom. I'll stay here and fight for the ranch." He took the document, the weight of it far greater than a single sheet of paper. He was no longer just a hired hand, or a drifter, or a suspect. He was a champion, an advocate, an agent of a trust so profound it humbled him. He looked at Catherine, a woman who had every reason to barricade her heart, and instead had chosen to open the gate, and knew he would not fail her. Outside, the rain began to fall in earnest, a steady, relentless downpour that was turning the dust to mud and the river to a rising, angry beast. The two storms, one of law and one of nature, were about to break. The courtroom was small and airless, smelling of stale cigar smoke and damp wool. The rain beat a relentless tattoo against the windows, each pane weeping streaks of muddy water. The sound was a constant, oppressive reminder of the storm raging outside, a mirror to the tense, constrained battle within. Judge Abernathy, a man whose jowls seemed to weigh down his sense of justice, peered over his spectacles with an expression of profound boredom. Silas Crowley sat beside his lawyer, looking perfectly at ease, a spider in the center of his web. Jake stood before the judge's bench, Catherine's power of attorney held in his hand. He was not a lawyer, and he did not try to be. He spoke in plain, direct language, his voice a low, steady counterpoint to the drumming rain. He presented Nora's meticulously drawn map, pointing to the location of the illegal dam. He described its construction, the fresh-cut timber, the deliberate diversion of the river's main channel. "This isn't a case of drought, Your Honor," Jake concluded. "It's a case of theft, water theft, on a scale that threatens not just the Sterling Ranch, but every smallholder downstream." Crowley's lawyer, a slick man with a voice like oiled leather, rose to his feet. "Objection. These are wild, unsubstantiated claims from a hired hand with a known reputation. He presents a child's drawing and calls it a map. He has no proof whatsoever that my client, a pillar of this community, has anything to do with some crude pile of rocks miles upriver." "I have proof," Jake said, his voice cutting through the lawyer's condescending tone. He unwrapped the oilcloth from the piece of timber and set it on the table with a solid thud. The Crowley Cattle Company stencil was dark and undeniable. A murmur went through the small crowd. Judge Abernathy shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Crowley's confident smirk wavered for the first time. "A piece of wood that could have come from anywhere," the lawyer scoffed, though his voice had lost some of its conviction. "Anyone could have put it there." "Then perhaps the court would be interested in hearing from the man who was paid to put it there," a new voice said. The courtroom doors opened, and Nora Quinn stepped inside, followed by a nervous, fidgeting man in worn clothes, his face pale. It was one of the Sawyers Jake had seen near the dam. Nora had spent the last 2 days tracking him down, appealing to the man's buried conscience and his fear of being implicated in a far greater crime. The Sawyer, sworn in, spoke in a halting voice, his eyes fixed on the floor. He testified that he and another man had been hired directly by Silas Crowley, paid in cash, to build the dam quickly and quietly. He described the orders to make it block as much water as possible. The atmosphere in the courtroom had turned electric. Crowley was on his feet, his face purple with rage, shouting at his lawyer. Judge Abernathy was banging his gavel, his feigned boredom replaced by genuine panic. It was in that moment of legal chaos that a new sound broke through the storm, a low, distant roar, a sound that was not thunder. It was deeper, more guttural, a vibration felt in the bones more than heard with the ears. The courtroom doors burst open again. This time it was Tom Bradley, drenched and breathless, his young face a mask of terror. "The dam," he shouted, his voice cracking. It broke. "A wall of water is coming down the canyon. It's going to hit the town." The world shifted. The legal battle, which had seemed so monumental seconds before, evaporated in the face of a far more immediate and terrible justice. Panic erupted. People scrambled for the doors, their chairs overturning with a crash. Jake's eyes met Nora's across the room. She nodded, her face grim. The legal fight was over for now. The fight for survival had just begun. Jake was the first one out the door, with Tom at his heels. Outside, the town was a scene of pandemonium. The rain was coming down in blinding sheets. The roar was louder now, a constant, grinding thunder that grew closer with every second. The Willow River, normally a placid stream, was already swelling, its water the color of mud, churning with debris. "The ferry landing," Jake yelled to Tom above the din. "It's the lowest point we have to get people to the high ground on the east bank, across the old Barrow Flats." There was no time for orders, only for action. Jake vaulted onto Tempest, who had been waiting patiently under the livery awning. The great stallion was agitated by the storm, but steady under Jake's command. Together, they became a beacon of calm in the chaos. Jake rode into the swirling crowds, his voice a clear, commanding bellow, directing the terrified townspeople away from the river and toward the gently rising sandbars that offered their only path to safety. The first wave hit with the force of a battering ram. It wasn't just water. It was a churning slurry of mud, rock, and shattered timber from Crowley's dam. It slammed into the building nearest the river, tearing the ferry landing from its moorings. A wagon was lifted and tossed aside like a child's toy. The shrieks of the people were swallowed by the river's furious roar. Tom Bradley, on his nervous gelding, found his courage. He followed Jake's lead, riding along the edge of the rising water, pulling people from the mud, urging them toward the flats. He saw a small girl, no older than 5, clinging to the roots of a massive cottonwood tree as the water swirled around her waist. The tree groaned, its foundation eaten away by the flood, and began to topple. Without a second thought, Tom urged his horse into the current, leaning down and scooping the child into his arms just as the tree crashed into the river with a great splash. He had become the man he had aspired to be. The ferry landing was a death trap, a bottleneck of panicked people and rising water. Deputy Hale was there, his face a mask of primal fear. He saw Jake on the far side, organizing the last of the stragglers. In Hale's terrified, guilty mind, Jake was the source of all of this. If not for Jake, the dam would have held. If not for Jake, the truth would have stayed buried. He drew his pistol, his hand shaking, and pointed it at Jake. "This is your fault, Morrison!" he screamed, his voice thin against the roar of the flood. Nora Quinn had been helping a family with a small child when she saw Hale draw his weapon. She didn't hesitate. In her medical bag, she carried a small, single-shot Derringer, a last line of defense for a woman who often traveled to remote ranches alone. She pulled it out, her movement swift and sure. She was a doctor. She knew anatomy. She aimed not for his chest, but for the thick muscle of his arm. The crack of the small pistol was sharp and clear. Hale cried out, his pistol clattering to the ground as his arm went limp, a dark stain spreading on his sleeve. He stared at his useless limb, then at Nora, his expression one of utter disbelief. A woman, a healer, had just disarmed him,
In the courtroom, Crowley, abandoned by his lawyer and the judge, had been temporarily placed in a holding cell by the stunned sheriff. But as the water burst through the front door of the jailhouse, the sheriff, thinking only of his own skin, fled, leaving Crowley locked inside. The water rose with terrifying speed. Crowley rattled the bars, his shouts for help lost in the deluge. The floodwaters had crested. The town was a ruin of muddy water and broken buildings, on a small island of high ground. Jake was making a final count of the survivors he had herded there. He saw the jailhouse, water pouring from its windows. He knew who was inside. Every instinct for self-preservation, every ounce of anger at the man who had tried to destroy Catherine and frame him, told him to leave Crowley to his fate. It would be justice. The river itself would be the executioner. But as he looked across the churning water at the desperate face pressed against the bars, he didn't see an enemy. He saw a man, terrified and drowning. He thought of the war, of the men he had killed because he had to. He had vowed then that he would never take a life out of hatred or revenge. To leave Crowley to die would be a betrayal of that vow. It would be an execution. "Tom, get these people the rest of the way to the high road," he yelled. Then, before anyone could stop him, he urged Tempest back into the raging current. The horse fought against the powerful water, its strong legs finding purchase on the unseen ground below. They reached the jailhouse, and Jake, using a piece of salvaged timber, smashed the lock on the cell door. He pulled a sputtering, terrified Silas Crowley from the flooded cell and hauled him onto Tempest's back. From the edge of the high ground, Catherine watched the entire scene unfold. She had been working alongside Nora, tearing her skirts for bandages, comforting frightened children. She had seen Nora shoot Hale, and now she saw this. She saw Jake, the man Crowley had tried to ruin, risk his own life to save his bitterest enemy. She saw him refuse to let the flood do his dirty work. He was choosing mercy over vengeance, life over death, in the face of a man who deserved none of it. It was not an act of forgiveness. It was an act of profound integrity. He was a man who would not be broken, not by war, not by injustice, and not by the temptation of righteous revenge. In that moment, watching him guide Tempest through the receding waters with his enemy clinging to him, Catherine knew the fear she had carried for so long, the fear of trusting, of depending on anyone, finally washed away. This was a man she could give her heart to. This was the man she could entrust with her life. The dawn that followed the flood broke over a valley transformed. The world was washed clean and scoured raw. A landscape of glistening mud and debris. The Willow River, its fury spent, had retreated to its banks, leaving behind a testament to its power. Dry Willow was a ruin, but it was a quiet ruin. The roar of the water had been replaced by the sound of hammers, the shouts of men organizing work crews, and the low murmur of a community waking from a nightmare. The catastrophe had been a great leveler. In the shared work of digging out, there was no distinction between Crowley's allies and Catherine's supporters. There was only the mud, the wreckage, and the common need to rebuild. The flimsy dam, a monument to one man's greed, had created a disaster that could only be undone by the hands of all. Jake Morrison, the man they had once called a drifter and a thief, became the valley's reluctant leader. His quiet competence, his innate understanding of the land and the water, made him the natural center of the recovery effort. He organized the men, showing them how to clear the vital irrigation channels without causing more erosion, how to salvage timber, and how to reinforce the weakened riverbanks. He worked harder than any of them, his presence a steady, reassuring constant in the chaotic aftermath. Within a week, the territorial marshal arrived from Santa Fe, a grizzled veteran of a lawman with eyes that had seen everything and were impressed by nothing. He had come to investigate the reports of a collapsed dam and a courtroom in chaos. The evidence Nora and Jake had gathered, combined with the sworn testimony of the Sawyer and a dozen other townspeople who had finally found their courage, painted a picture so clear and damning that the legal proceedings were swift. Deputy Hale, his arm in a sling and his arrogance shattered, was stripped of his badge and charged with conspiracy and endangerment. He accepted his fate with a dull resignation. A man who had sold his soul so cheaply, he seemed surprised it had cost him so much. Silas Crowley, his expensive suit ruined and his power washed away by the flood he had unleashed, faced a different kind of justice. His rescue by Jake had stripped him of any claim to martyrdom. He was not a victim. He was a fool who had been saved from his own folly. The marshal, seeing that Crowley's influence was now worthless, imposed a punishment designed to bleed him dry. Massive fines were levied for the illegal dam, for the damages to the town, and for the endangerment of its citizens. His water rights were permanently revoked, and his vast land holdings were placed under lien, effectively crippling his empire. He was left a wealthy man on paper, but a pauper in the currency that mattered in the valley respect. The town council, humbled and chastened, convened a meeting not in the ruined courthouse, but in the newly repaired church. They drew up a new water compact, a document that guaranteed fair shares for every landowner along the river, from the smallest homestead to the largest ranch. They formally and publicly ratified Catherine Sterling's claim to her land and water, clearing her of all tax debts in light of the damages she had suffered. It was a new law for a new era, born from disaster and built on the foundation of shared survival. As the valley healed, so did the people within it. The Sterling Ranch, though it had lost its barn, became a hub of activity and hope. The salvaged timbers were stacked, ready for a new structure. The horses, once spooked and scattered, were calm, reassured by Jake's steady hand. Tom Bradley, now a permanent hand at the ranch, worked with a new maturity, the memory of the flood having burned away the last of his boyish uncertainty. One evening, as the last light of the sun painted the wet grasslands in shades of gold and rose, Catherine and Jake sat on the porch steps. They were weary from a long day of clearing a blocked channel, their clothes and hands stained with the rich, dark mud of the riverbank. A comfortable silence settled between them, the only sounds the chirping of crickets and the soft nicker of a horse in the corral. "You never told me," Catherine said softly, breaking the quiet, "at the river. You said you were running from a storm in your past. The thing that happened up north." Jake was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the darkening horizon. He had carried the story for so long, a piece of shrapnel lodged deep inside him. He had never told anyone the whole truth of it, not even the army doctors who had patched up his other wounds. "It wasn't much of a storm," he began, his voice low, more like a fog. "After the war, I couldn't find my footing. Everything was loud. The memories. The quiet was the worst. I took to drinking more than I should, just to fill the silence." He paused, picking up a small stone and turning it over and over in his calloused fingers. "One night, I was working a cattle drive in Colorado. Took a bad fall from my horse. Hit my head hard. The foreman told me to sleep it off in the livery. When I woke up, the sun was high. My head felt like it had been split with an axe, and the sheriff was standing over me. The foreman's prize stallion was gone, and my saddle was on a strange horse in the next stall. They said I'd stolen the stallion and traded him for a lesser horse and a bottle of whiskey." He looked at Catherine, his eyes full of a distant, remembered pain. "I couldn't remember a thing. The fog in my head was so thick, I couldn't say for sure I hadn't done it. I had no one to speak for me. No history in that town but that of a quiet man who drank alone. It was easier for everyone to believe I was a thief." "So you ran?" she whispered. "I ran," he confirmed with a quiet finality. Seemed better than waiting for a verdict I couldn't fight. Catherine reached out and placed her hand over his, stilling the movement of the stone. His skin was rough, but his hand was warm and steady beneath hers. "You're not running anymore, Jake." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. She had taken down the wall she had built around her heart, the one meant to protect the memory of her late husband. For years, she had been surviving, not living, preserving a past instead of building a future. The flood had washed that all away. She saw the ranch not as a memorial, but as a living, breathing place with a future. Her future. And she could not imagine that future without the man sitting beside her. He turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers. "No," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely showed. "I'm not." They sat like that as the stars began to appear, a silent promise passing between them. A few days later, after a grueling day spent setting the foundation posts for the new barn, Jake made his proposal. There was no fanfare, no kneeling in the dirt. He was washing his hands in the basin on the porch, the scent of pine soap and wet earth in the air. Catherine was leaning against the railing, watching the last of the evening light fade. "Catherine," he said, his back still to her as he dried his hands on a rough linen towel. "I've been thinking, this ranch is going to need a lot of work for a long time. It's a permanent job." He turned to face her, his expression serious, a vulnerability in his eyes she had never seen before. "The bunkhouse is fine, but I'm tired of being a temporary hand. I was hoping my position here could be as permanent as the work." He took a small step closer. "I was hoping you'd let me stay. For good." It was the most honest, unadorned proposal she could have ever imagined. And it was perfect. She didn't need poetry or promises of wealth. She needed the quiet strength, the unwavering integrity of the man before her. She closed the small space between them and stood on her toes, pressing her lips to his. The kiss was not one of fiery passion, but of deep, resonant certainty. It tasted of dust and sweat and the clean scent of sage after a rain. It was a kiss that felt like coming home. The next spring, as the valley bloomed with a ferocity it hadn't shown in years, a new life arrived at the Sterling Ranch. One morning, Tom Bradley came running from the pasture, his face split by a wide grin. Catherine and Jake followed him out to the far meadow, where the herd was grazing peacefully on the lush new grass. There, standing close to his mother, was a newborn foal. He was solid black, a perfect, miniature version of his sire, his long legs still wobbly, but his eyes holding the same spark of intelligent fire. Tempest stood nearby, a proud and watchful guardian, the wild stallion now a patriarch. He looked at Jake, and for a moment, it seemed as if an understanding passed between them, a recognition of the peace and the promise that had finally taken root in this small corner of the world. The storm had passed, and in its wake, new life was beginning. The years that followed the flood were years of slow, steady mending. The Sterling Morrison Ranch, as it was now known, became a symbol of the valley's resilience. The new barn, built with the help of the entire community, stood taller and stronger than the one it replaced. Its fresh pine scent a constant reminder of renewal. The scar on the land where the flood had ripped through the valley slowly healed, covered over by the stubborn green of new grass. The legacy of the storm was not one of fear, but of change. On Saturday mornings, the ranch was no longer a private sanctuary, but a place of learning. Catherine and Jake had started a small riding school for the children of the valley. It was not about creating show riders or rodeo champions. It was about teaching a different kind of relationship with the world. Jake, who had once been a man of so few words, found he had a quiet gift for teaching. "You don't tell the horse what to do," he would explain to a small boy with wide, nervous eyes, his hand resting gently on the neck of a patient Shetland pony. "You ask, and before you ask, you listen. See his ears. They're telling you he's listening to the birds in the cottonwoods. Wait for them to turn to you. That's when he's ready to hear what you have to say." He taught them to see strength not in the pull of the reins or the kick of a heel, but in the quiet bond of trust. He was undoing the old, harsh ways of the West, one child at a time, replacing the impulse to conquer with the patience to cooperate. Catherine would watch him, her heart swelling with a quiet, profound pride. She saw the man who had tamed Tempest now teaching a 5-year-old girl how to braid a pony's mane, and knew that this, more than any title deed or fence line, was their true legacy. Tom Bradley was a cornerstone of that legacy. The earnest young man who had once hero-worshipped Jake had grown into a capable and respected range manager. The circle had closed. The student had become the master of his own domain. He ran the cattle operations with a calm authority, his decisions guided by the lessons Jake had taught him about reading the land, the weather, and the animals. He knew which pastures would be richest after a rain, which canyons offered the best shelter from the wind, and which of the hands needed a firm word and which needed a quiet encouragement. One afternoon, Catherine saw him from the porch, sitting on his horse at the crest of a hill, a younger hand beside him. Tom was pointing out toward the horizon, his posture and his quiet confidence a near-perfect mirror of Jake. He was passing the knowledge on, ensuring that the humane and thoughtful way of managing the land would continue long after they were all gone. Jake had not just given him a job, he had given him a purpose. The town of Dry Willow had settled into a new kind of peace. The water compact held, a testament to the hard-learned lesson that a shared resource was a shared responsibility. Silas Crowley was a ghost, a name spoken only in cautionary tales. He had moved away, his empire dismantled, his name a byword for the kind of ambition that consumes itself. The quiet order of the valley was no longer the tense silence of fear, but the comfortable silence of mutual respect. Several years had passed. The seasons had turned, each one leaving the land a little richer, their family a little stronger. On a warm, late summer afternoon, they returned to the place where their story had truly begun, the gentle bend in the Willow River, where the warm spring bubbled from the rocks. The air was sweet with the scent of wild roses and damp earth. Their daughter, Willow, was a whirlwind of life and curiosity, a perfect fusion of her parents. She had Catherine's determined spirit in her bright, intelligent eyes and Jake's quiet, watchful grace in her movements. She was 4 years old, a small, fierce storm of scraped knees and dandelion wishes. She was chasing a monarch butterfly, her delighted shrieks echoing in the quiet grove as it danced just ahead of her outstretched fingers. The butterfly fluttered near the river's edge, and Willow, her eyes fixed on her prize, followed without a thought. Her small boot, slick with dew from the grass, slipped on a mossy stone, perhaps the very same stone, the same treacherous root system that had sent her mother tumbling years before. Her small body pitched forward. Catherine's heart leaped into her throat, a purely parental reflex of terror and helplessness. But before she could even take a step, Jake moved. He was not the scarred, guarded drifter anymore, but he still possessed the same preternatural swiftness, the same economy of motion. He closed the distance in 2 silent strides and scooped Willow up an instant before she would have fallen, lifting her high into the air. Willow, surprised but unafraid, let out a peal of laughter, the danger of the moment completely lost on her. She wrapped her small arms around her father's neck, her butterfly forgotten. Jake held his daughter close, his own heart settling back into its steady rhythm. He looked over Willow's head at Catherine, who stood with her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with a mixture of relief and a flood of memory. In his gaze, she saw it all: the murky pre-dawn light, the shared laughter in the water, the feeling of his shirt on her shoulders. It was all there, in the quiet space that had always existed between them. A slow, familiar smile spread across Jake's face, crinkling the corners of his eyes. He gave Catherine a subtle, knowing wink. "Well," he said, his voice a low, warm rumble as he adjusted their laughing daughter in his arms. "Looks like this little storm is welcome, too." Catherine's breath caught, and a smile broke through her relief, as bright and warm as the afternoon sun. She walked to him, placing her hand on his arm, her other hand stroking her daughter's tangled hair. The past and the present converged in that perfect, simple moment. The storms they had weathered, the ones of dust and drought, of fire and flood, of loneliness and fear, had all led them here, to this quiet peace. Their love had never been a raging fire, but a steady, underground spring, a hidden source of warmth that had nourished them, healed them, and now flowed onward, a quiet and enduring legacy in the heart of the valley. Thank you for listening to our story tonight. We'd love for you to comment where you're listening from so we can all connect, and please subscribe to our channel Wild West Night. Like the video, and press that hype button to help share this story with more listeners.